Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Tracy Scapestra, and this is Body Talk. Every week, Embodied Learnings brings you Body Talk because we are committed to bringing the body into the elementary classroom and into the curriculum. We do this because we believe it supports student learning, student engagement, mental health and wellness, and for thriving classrooms and school communities. Now, today we have a wonderful topic. We are talking about math and movement. And I have a special guest here with me. This is Professor Susan McNabb from OISE. And I am so delighted, Susan, that you're with me. So welcome to Body Talk.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, before we get started on this, what could be a huge conversation, because there's so much we could talk about, and we will get to some really key points. I would love it if you could share with our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Well, as Tracy mentioned, I teach in the Master of Teaching program, perhaps you didn't say that part, at OISE, and it's primary, junior, and intermediate math. My background is actually in music. My undergrad is music, piano, and composition, and I then studied architecture, which has been referred to as frozen music, so there's a link there, and became very interested in education when I had my amazing child, because he was just so completely fascinating. I then, so I did it sort of back to front. I then got my Bachelor of Education degree, and my intermediate math AQ immediately afterwards, and was teaching in a private all-girls school where I had a class of girls who professed to not be good at math. Every single one of them, they had written an entrance test to get into the school, and still they claimed, that they were going to fail math that year. And I thought, in what universe does this make sense? So that drove me back to graduate school. My master's work was in girls and math learning and how best to support young women to do well in math. And that led into my doctoral research, which was in growing patterns, again, very sort of experiential, but growing patterns with grade 2 kids, and growing patterns as they underpin functional relationship, which leads to algebraic understanding. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Some of that I actually did not know. I definitely knew about the music connection, but I didn't realize that you'd worked in a girls' private school.
I had, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Wonderful. I always like to let our viewers know also how it is that we came to know each other. And I did my PhD at OISE and was the dance specialist. And you heard that I was available to go from class to class to do dance workshops, which I was doing sort of in the main cohorts. Nobody had asked me to come into sort of more subject specific areas. And you reached out and said, would you be willing to do a math and movement workshop? Of which I wrote back, yes, absolutely. And then absolutely panicked on my end because I was that female who felt that she was terrible at math. And quite honestly, I really was not great at math, but I also think I didn't have a great teacher. I don't think at the time when I was at school, I was taught in a way that worked for me. I think had I been taught the way that I needed to learn, which was very kinesthetic, I probably would have done much differently. So I think that it's not that I don't have the capabilities of being good at math. I think it was really a sort of that learning. So I reached out to my cousin who was a dancer and also a high school math teacher. And she said, you're way overthinking this. Math and movement are so much more connected. And she sat me down and she really looked at it with me. She showed me the curriculum and I went, oh my goodness, wow. Like, look at that. I had no idea. So with that said, I think it would be really helpful for you to tell us a little bit about those misconceptions of what math really is, or maybe what math is not, however you want to share.
Okay, so Tracy, first of all, I would completely support your understanding
Mm.
that it was how you were taught
Mm.
and not your capability. And I think that how you were we're taught is likely the very conventional way, which defines math as arithmetic. I mean, we know that I was a little apprehensive about what the new math curriculum would look like, and we'll talk about that a bit later, because this government was talking a lot about back to the basics. And I was terribly afraid, but in actual fact, it's quite wonderful in many, many ways because it's not that. But if we think of arithmetic, that's one tiny component to the field of mathematics. So I would say that arithmetic is to mathematics as spelling or rules of grammar are to language. And we know that language is, huge. As is mathematics. So we would never confine a young child to practicing spelling words only, and not writing stories or reading stories for all of the elementary grades. And yet that's what we tend to do in mathematics.
Mm.
So to me, math is, well, I'll tell you the definition I like best, and it's by Sawyer in the 50s. He was a wonderful, insightful mathematician. And he said in a very concise way, math is the study of all possible patterns. And I love that definition. And to me, that ties in beautifully with dance and movement as well, because that involves pattern to a very great extent. So I guess I see mathematics as tying into a, it's an almost universal expression, I think. It's a very human endeavor because it's ways that people over centuries learn to describe the world we live in, to understand it and create short forms, which we refer to now as algorithms, but those were developed from real life experiences. So mathematics to me ties in beautifully with dance, with music, with architecture. There's really nothing that math does not connect to, but the connection to dance seemed to me to be so clear. um, as a little kid, like many children, I studied dance and I loved it. It was just one of those things that fell by the wayside as I got older, and other things sort of intervened. But you were mentioning earlier all the terminology that belongs with dance that also fits in the realm of mathematics. So did you want to say that all those words you mentioned earlier?
Absolutely. I think it would be really helpful to really look at where we have the similarities between the
Yes.
the curriculum for people so that they really understand. So I will throw out some words and a few of others by all means share them. So some of the things that immediately come to mind is spatial awareness.
Yes.
It is direction,
Mhm.
perception, sort of having a sense of proximity in space. So I guess that's still spatial awareness, patterning, sequencing. What else do I have on my list? Oh, mirroring, unison.
Yeah.
So there's symmetry. I don't know if I already said that, but
Yeah. So, I mean, all of those junior grades teachers will recognize um, the idea of reflection as being one of the transformations that students need to understand how to do, and to have them do it in real life and know in a very embodied way what that feels like and what it looks like, is so helpful to our students when it comes time for them to do it in a more abstract way with pencil and paper, or hopefully with manipulatives in between as sort of one step towards that. But yeah, yeah. And just to lob in here, Tracy, spatial awareness and the ability to mentally manipulate objects in space is apparently a very strong predictor of how students will do on standard math tests. So one of the things we really need to do in order to allow our kids to be successful is to let them experience moving in space and understand what that's all about so that they can later on um, extrapolate from that and imagine what something would look like if it were turned 90 degrees, if it were flipped. All of this terminology is really helpful. So it's the experience of doing it that fills their sort of reservoir of understanding and allows them to draw on that later on when they're asked to do it in the abstract.
Mm,
But
absolutely.
that's critical to even conventional
Mm.
math test performance. So yeah.
It's interesting because if I were to sit and just have to do that on paper, I
Yes.
that I just automatically think that that might be complicated. But as I hear you speaking it from a movement perspective, I
Yes.
already have ideas of how, I can mirror a shape.
Yes.
How is it that I could rotate that shape? So what does it look like in my body if I rotate it? So if I rotate it sideways, what would it look like if the shape were flipped upside down? So not that I have to stand on my head, but how do I use my body differently to show sort of the reflected, or
Yes.
the sort of that opposite
Yes.
experience? Or how might I turn a shape, sideways, or make it longer or shorter? And we do that within the body. We can actually do that quite, well,
Yeah.
simply it feels for me, but
Yes. Or
that's
even, I mean, again, junior grades teachers know slides, flips, and turns, and
mm,
all of that you can do with the body. And it
right,
makes total sense when
right.
it's you in your body doing it
Mhm.
in ways that, a version on the blackboard doesn't quite do.
Yes, absolutely. And mirroring is a very simple activity that I always do with my teacher candidates. And for them, that's a very simple way of understanding symmetry. Just imagine that you are looking in a mirror and your partner is your following. One's the leader, one's the follower. But then I also like to change it where it's opposites. So if I go out, you might come in. If I go up, you might go down. If I go narrow, you go wide. And can they work slowly, but kind of look at, well, how do I respond
Yeah.
differently in doing that? Or simply moving through space. Can you fill the empty spaces? Or how do you do that by making sure you have a proximity of space between each person? Or
Mhm.
stopping on the stage in a particular spot, and can you move around and come back to that spot? And how do you know you're in that spot based on your awareness of all the things around you? And that seems to really kind of click, like, oh, I'm actually, these are all mathematical concepts, and yet we're just moving.
There, excuse me, there was a couple, the Van Heelys,
Mm,
who created a way of looking at geometric and spatial understanding and learning.
mm,
And this comes from the 50s, but there's been a bit of a resurgence of interest in their theory. And it depends a great deal on teaching as opposed to development, which is more the Piagetian model of how children
mm,
understand mathematical ideas. And the first level, they have 5 levels. The very first one is visualization, and that is dependent on experience. It's with very little kids. How do they see the world? How do they experience it and understand it? So one of the things I love about the Van Heely's theoretical model, their framework, is that it does put it squarely on the shoulders of teachers to create opportunities for kids to experience the various concepts that they need to learn so that they can internalize it and embody it and abstract from that.
mm. Wonderful. Now, you had me come into your class. I think I was in at least three or four of your classes
Mhm, mhm.
over sort of a few year period, where I was able to do workshops. And you collected sort of some notes or data, I guess, per se, of
Yeah.
sort of what their experience was of
Mhm.
actually doing the math through the body, having the embodied experience
Yes.
of the learning. And you were sharing with me that you recently read some of those notes, and I thought it would be wonderful to share some of what it is that those students sort of shared with you
Mhm,
of
mhm.
their experience.
Well, with us really, because I think they were addressed to you and me after your workshop. Um, but yes, there was like a common theme of feeling freed
Mm,
to explore these and little epiphanies of things suddenly making sense.
mm,
Um, I know that we also, I'm not sure if it was when you were there, Tracy, or not, but doing a grid
mm,
and with coordinates
right.
and and having students be a point on the Cartesian plane and understanding, which side of the x-axis or y-axis they're landing on and why, and actually moving. If you're to be move uh, -2 spaces along the x-axis and +3 on the y-axis, what does that feel like when you do it? So there were all these sort of sudden understandings, and I think we had them standing up and sitting down, like everyone who's where x and y are the same value,
Mm,
stand up, everyone else sit down.
mm,
And there was this beautiful diagonal line that popped up, and they all went, oh, it suddenly made sense to them. Or everyone who has an X value of 2, please stand up. And there's a horizontal line that pops up. So all of that. Um, the possibility of exploring space
mm,
as they did. You had some wonderful, wonderful activities for them to do. The mirroring is one. I love the flocking that you did, where there were 4 together
yeah.
and the leader changed. Um, and they created some very, very beautiful shapes together as a group and with their own bodies, and felt that they really enjoyed doing it.
Mm,
Doing it to the music also, I
mhm,
think, really helped, and they became less and less self-conscious
mm,
as the class wore on. So yeah, they just I think freeing was one of the main things that came out. And as I say, these epiphanies of suddenly getting
mm,
what it meant, what they'd been taught years ago in a pencil and paper way, to actually be actively doing it
mhm,
was a very new and different experience for them. And I think one of the classes of mine that you came into, it was at a time when we were talking a lot about DPA, or daily physical
mhm.
activity.
Yes.
And there were many of the activities that you introduced that could combine all of those, the math, the movement, and the daily physical activity, which I still think is a good idea, but I think it's talked about less
Yes.
than it used to be. Yeah.
And I'm going to be sharing that activity with our newsletter subscribers. The one you're talking about was actually using different numbers. No, sorry, different letters. So we had the letters A, B, and C, and
Yes.
each letter was given a movement value. So what I do with my teacher candidates when I do this with them is I give them, this year I won't be able to hand out envelopes to them, but they can make them at home. And
Yeah.
so they get to take A and say, what movement is A? So let's say they call A marching, and then B is given something else. So it might be flapping. So flapping my wings. So marching, flapping, and C might be clapping.
Yes.
And then we give a certain number of beats per letter. So I did it 8 because most pop music or most music we listen to is sort of in an 8-beat count. So it makes it easy to follow along with the beat of the music. So we will do 8 counts for A, so 8 counts of marching, 8 counts for B, so 8 counts of flapping, and 8 counts of C, which is 8 counts of clapping. And then, of course, you can have a number of A, B's, and C's, and you can lay them out in different orders. So they create their own pattern. So they know that every time they do A, they do this movement, B, but it could be A, B, 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 C, A, C, B, A. Or, right? So you can play with all kinds of
Yeah.
things. And
Yeah.
so it becomes a lot of fun because they can keep mixing it around. And then if they want, we can add and say, okay, each one is 2 counts of 8. So you every 2 counts of 8, you switch to the next letter, and so
Yeah.
forth. So there's, yeah, lots of ways you can play. And of course, with younger students, it can just be simply A B A B A B.
Mhm, mhm.
So
And
it's very,
play, I think
pardon?
play, I think, is such an
Yeah.
important word for you to put in
Yeah.
at this point, because all too often our students think of math as a sort of arduous and something to be dreaded, which
Mhm.
makes kids really anxious about it.
Yes.
And yet there's so much play that's mathematical.
Mhm.
And there's no reason on earth we can't make mathematics inviting and accessible through exactly what you're describing as something fun to do and play. And they're internalizing and learning, but it's enjoyable.
Hmm. So sometimes, teacher candidates or teachers I've worked with want to know, like, what's an appropriate amount of play you can bring. I think there's this idea that math is meant to be quite serious.
Yes,
So,
yes,
do we do a little bit of movement here and there once a week? Or is it okay to just really let our students guide us and bring in that play as long as they're learning the curriculum and they're making the connections? Like, do you have any thoughts around sort of how we balance the sort of pen and or pencil and paper versus the getting up
right,
and pushing the desks away?
right. Pencils and papers are very helpful to record things that we're doing.
Okay.
So I would kind of put them together,
Okay.
and say that the doing is the most important.
Yeah.
The doing, internalizing, embodying is so helpful, and it lasts. It's the kind of learning that sticks with us, all of us, whether we're young or old. Um, Being told something, it's easy to forget. But constructing algorithms on your own, for example, by actually doing.
Mhm.
um, One thing I do with my teacher candidates, which is movement based, is the handshake problem. It's a very classic math problem, but where they just simply have to shake hands with one another, and they construct the algorithm they do it in a group of 4 and then a group of 10, and then extrapolate from there and figure out how would you sort this out for any number. And that's when the pencil and paper come in handy. But it's the doing part first. um, I, One of the things too that I'd like to dispel immediately is the notion that math is a solitary endeavor.
I was just going to bring that point up.
Oh,
Yeah, no, I'm so glad because in my head, I'm like, that's why math was so hard. I
yeah,
felt alone. And if I didn't get it,
yeah,
I fell behind. And and
it,
it was embarrassing.
yeah, yeah. And so that ties in with growth mindset too, which is Joe Bowler and Carol Dweck's work at Stanford. And just the idea of, I mean, when I was learning math in school, um, the idea that you conferred with somebody else was thought of as cheating. You were supposed to know it all by yourself, or you weren't worth your salt somehow. So the idea of, but that doesn't make sense in any context. Many minds are better than one person sort of all by themselves getting disheartened. So many minds working on a problem and bouncing ideas off of one another, which is why things like the Math Congress, or even lesson study for teachers, that collaboration
Mhm.
is, I think, really helpful in supporting us to think together. And that does tie in very much with Bowler and Dweck's in independent work, but both in math, from Stanford, on growth mindset, which basically, I'm sure that you're familiar with this, but the ideas are that we do construct knowledge together. It's collaborative.
Mhm.
The best ideas over history have come, from people bouncing ideas off of one another and building on one another's notions. It also is the case that there's a myth of one right answer in mathematics, and
Mhm.
that has been translated very often to only one right method for getting to the answer. Now,
Mhm.
sometimes I would differentiate between solution and answer, because I think that answer is a discrete value. And it can be important to have the one right answer, but the way you get to it, there are many and varied methods of getting to the answer. And that's where the thinking and reasoning comes in. And that's the territory of solution. So the idea of growth mindset just says that there are multiple ways of solving a mathematical problem and multiple ways of expressing your mathematical understanding, your thinking and reasoning about a
Mm.
math problem. And that if you happen to, in quotes, make a mistake, that it's not the end of the world. It's, in fact, the opposite. It's a site for learning and growth. So whenever we stumble,
Mhm.
that means basically that we're trying so hard that we've just sort of tripped over the edge of what we're able to do easily, which means that we're into territory where we're truly learning because we don't know how to do this yet. So if there's a stumble, that's the area where there's real growth. And Joe Bowler has done some very interesting work demonstrating that synapses in the brain fire and grow and she's written about this very beautifully. But the idea that this causes our brains to essentially develop new synapses and grow. So the more we do and the more times we push so hard that we're stumbling and have to pick ourselves up and regroup and try again, the better for our brains, for our math understanding. So I put all of that growth mindset work in as really, really critical and important. And if people want the references, Bowler is Boaler, and it's Joe, J-O, and this is a woman, Joe, and Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. And they've both done some amazing work. Carol Dweck does more intermediate work. Joe Bowler is primary junior primarily.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wonderful. As you were speaking, it was making me think of how I have to communicate with my mother when she comes to visit and she needs to go somewhere and I need to give her directions, and
Yes.
how there is not one way in which to communicate how she gets from point A, which is my home, to point B, where she's going.
Yes.
And that I know that the way that I understand directions doesn't actually work for her. And so we start by looking at a visual map, and then we actually draw a map that she can follow so that she can stand as if and visualize as if she's driving. And then
Yes.
we will do the lefts and rights, but she needs to visually see the pattern and the path,
Yes. Yes.
because
Yes.
I'm very much a go left, go right, go left, go left, go right, you're there. I
That's
can get
your
myself,
Zen instruction. Yeah.
yeah, it's very different, and that doesn't work for her.
Yeah.
Sometimes she gets turned around, and so I know that when she's driving places to have my phone on. And so if she calls, I'll say, "Where are you?" And then we can talk about the coordinates so
Yeah.
she can get
Yes.
herself there. And once she's done it once,
Yes.
it's fine.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I'll tell you a very funny little story
Yeah.
from many years ago. Um, our nephew Jeffrey was 5 at the time, and he's now grown.
Mhm.
Um, but my husband John was going with Jeffrey. John was driving the car, of course, and Jeffrey was giving him instructions
Mm.
for how to get to a mall that was near John's sister's house. This was in Buffalo. And Jeffrey was telling John to turn left and then turn right and then stop and then go ahead and left, left, right, right. And John thought to himself, this doesn't make any sense at all. They finally got to their destination, and John was astonished because they were there. They made it to where they were going. And it turned out it was actually just around the corner from his sister's house. What Jeffrey had done was he had taken John on the school bus route.
Oh,
And that was his experience of going to, past this mall. And he knew exactly what he was talking about, but his experiential understanding of how to get from here to there was the school bus and picking up different kids along the way.
Mm,
So yeah, I mean, our spatial understanding is so rooted in experience,
mm,
which is, I think, one of the big reasons we have to offer our students a whole range of different experiences of mathematical concepts,
mm.
so that they really deeply get it.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
absolutely. And not feel alone. And not
Yeah,
feel there's only one way. I love all those points that you brought up, which I think is a perfect lead in to talking about social and emotional learning in mathematics, which is part of the new Ontario curriculum. And not
mhm,
everybody watching is in Ontario, but we are very fortunate that Ontario curriculum is quite excellent. And I'm really glad to hear you say that you really like what you see.
I do.
And I really love that when I read this part of the curriculum, it made me think of why the arts in particular, and then of course movement connected to math, is
Mhm.
so powerful, because so much of what we learn in the arts is not about being an artist, whether that's a dancer or a musician, learning how to play an instrument, learning how to pick up a piece of choreography, but it is about growth mindset. It is about all of those aspects of social and emotional learning that are critical to life,
Yeah.
our ability to grow as human beings. So I often share with my students that what I teach them when I do dance and drama is collaboration. It is building confidence in themselves. It
Yes.
is about learning how to communicate in various ways, whether verbally or non verbally. Again, being able to memorize and learn something. And so there's just so many of those really
Yeah.
critical aspects that come, that we have to experience in our body. I mean, social emotional learning is really about body connection too. It
Yeah.
can't be intellectualized, it also has to be felt.
Yes, so much. And I have so many thoughts in response to what you just said. All of it so important. First of all, Joe Bowler wrote a really interesting article on the importance of kids being able to use their fingers to
Mm,
do arithmetic,
okay.
and that's a way of embodying learning and knowledge and understanding. Um, and I mean, this is base 10, it's really, it comes with us. It's very, very helpful to have. So I'd refer you to that. It was published in the Atlantic, I think 2 years ago. At any rate, I can send you the reference, Tracy, if it would be
Mm,
helpful. But oh, there was something else I was going to say in there. Oh, one thought is just that take your kids on a math trail,
mm,
which is going outside if you can. It can be in the school if you can't. It can be in the classroom even if you don't, can't
mhm,
walk around the school. But the neighborhood is best, the schoolyard's second best because they're outside, and I think that's critical too. But have them identify in their own realm, their own real life experience, all of the things you're talking with them about. So, for example, patterning, doing patterning through dance, identifying patterns in the real world,
mm,
all of that is just so important. And Ron Lancaster does some beautiful work on math trails,
mm,
and I'm happy to send you a few
mhm.
references for that if it would be helpful. And just to give a response to the new math curriculum. First, it came at a terrible time.
Yes.
Um, and I was really, yeah, I mean, as if we didn't have enough to contend with. The government says, okay, here's a new curriculum that you must be able to teach immediately. No opportunity to talk about it with anybody else, or very few opportunities. I know there were a couple of days at the beginning of the school year, but um, and so I was apprehensive when it came out. And plus, this government had talked so much about back to the basics.
Mm,
And I thought, this is going to be drill. It's going to take away all the bright, sparkly bits from what we could be doing in math. And and it wasn't, and largely because they wisely I mean, astonishingly to me, based it in great part on the work of Chris Sertem, who's at the University of Ottawa. And I've known Chris for many, many years, and she's such a thoughtful, like a deeply thoughtful math educator who really incorporates experience into her math programs.
Mm,
So I was delighted that they had based it on Chris's work. And it is a good document, even though we have not nearly had enough time to really digest it and think about it.
mhm,
And, sometimes thinking about things just takes time.
yeah,
We very often don't allow that in our classrooms, to ourselves in our own lives. We think that, for example, arithmetic facts have to be done like this, and faster the better. Sir Roger Penrose is a British mathematician who has been knighted for his work in mathematics and mathematical physics. And so, no slouch in terms of math accomplishment. And yet, he tells a story in an interview that was lovely. It was a few years ago. I think he may be 90 now, but of himself in grade 4. And I was actually thrilled to discover that he was in Canada for those years as a kid. So it was a Canadian teacher who offered him this opportunity, and I was pleased to know that, even though no connection. But and he was given a math test. He wrote his test all through the math period, and he still wasn't done. So the teacher let him write all through the period following. He still wasn't done. So his teacher allowed him to write all through recess and into the period following recess. And finally, he was done, and he handed in his math test, and he had done very well. Um, and if you can imagine, if he had been discouraged at the age of 9 or 10 in grade 4 from being allowed to do math in his own best way, what might have happened, what we would have been robbed of in terms of his mathematical achievements. So the notion that we need to do math quickly is really a misguided one. And I think many teachers will resonate with this. I think that it's kids who are really incredibly bright and have a whole lot in their minds, and who need to make a million and one connections before they can respond to a question,
mm,
who need more time, and that's fine. So this notion of speed tests and the mad minute are, like, if anything would put somebody off doing arithmetic, certainly, but math in general, because math is often defined as arithmetic, um, it would be that. Um, there was something else. Oh, yes, the idea of, we think that we have to sort of drill arithmetic facts into kids, when in fact it's simply repetition that allows us to remember things, and understanding. So if we find interesting ways for kids to repeat and understand
mm,
basic number facts, that that does the trick. I mean, why would we make it awful for them? So there was one year when I was in the classroom, and I had my students um, create a song and a dance for each of the times tables. Some of them were hilarious. I still have this image of a girl named Jane who did struggle with math, but they had the 8 times table, her little group of 3, and again, collaborative, so they came up with it together, doing the 8 times table to the tune and the dance of the can-can. That was what they'd selected. And they were collapsing with laughter as they were doing it, but they were having so much fun. And Jane forevermore remembered her 8 times table. And there were others in the class too, like each group did one
mhm,
of the times tables, and they remembered it as a result. Like, they remembered their friend spinning the wrong way at doing the dance, you
mm,
know. And it was fun, and it was funny, and it was creative, and it tapped into that part of themselves that was freed up, which is what my teacher candidates mentioned repeatedly in their responses to your workshop, that it was so freeing. And they didn't realize that doing math was a possibility at all, let alone so creative an endeavor.
Mm, that is just beautiful connections to everything that we talked about today. Yes, I just love that. And the more that we talk together about math, um, just the more I see the possibilities in how I can create those connections through embodied learnings and our work with dance education and movement integration. And I
Yes.
feel less and less afraid, which is wonderful. And I realize how math has very much been a part of my life just as a dancer,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
there's a lot that I have always been able to do quite easily. I just didn't realize that that was connected.
Yeah, and that's such an important bit, isn't it? To
Mhm,
allow our students to recognize all
mhm.
that they are doing already, so are capable
Yeah,
of doing, that because it didn't fit into the little tiny box of pencil and paper arithmetic,
mm,
they didn't really appreciate or understand that they knew so much math,
mm,
like you, Tracy.
yes. Yes, which is wonderful. And it's wonderful to, at my age, to start to feel a much greater level of comfort around it for sure. So I want to thank you for actually being the first person to take me out of that place of fear and
Oh,
to show me a path where I could make these connections. And,
well,
so I'm
Tracy,
really grateful for the work that we've done.
I am too, so, so much,
Yeah.
because your perspective as a dancer coming together with the mathematical ideas has been amazing for me as well. I've learned so much from you in terms of ways of doing this effectively for our students. Yeah, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time, but again, it's been wonderful speaking with you today and all that you've shared. And I will definitely take those references from you so that when we do provide a write up of Body Talk, that there's always links below so that people can follow through with anything that has been sort of suggested as a really good reference.
Yes,
So I will make sure to provide that for our viewers. Um,
great.
yeah, so that
And I don't know if this is a possibility, but if anyone has specific or general questions and would like to get in touch with me, I'm very open to that.
Oh, great. And I will share your contact information then as well.
Okay. Okay, great.
Wonderful. Well,
Okay.
thank you, Susan. And I'm just going to
Yes.
thank our viewers as well for listening to this wonderful conversation. For those of you, if you haven't been to our website, if you are new to Embodied Learnings, you can go to www.embodiedlearnings.com. We do have lots of resources. And again, this week when Body Talk is being published, this one on math and movement, we'll be sharing other resources and things with you, and we will continue to do so in the future. So until our next Body Talk, I wish you all well and thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.